Welcome along, very warm welcome to you all this evening. My name's Alice Parfitt. I am a conservation officer with Buglife, and this evening I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to Buglife, our work in Sussex as part of the Changing Chalk partnership. Then I'm going to hand over to Laurie Jackson, who's going to give us an introduction to pollinating insects, which will be wonderful. There's going to be plenty of times for questions at the end. So if you've got any questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat and we can go through them at the end. Okay, so for those of you that perhaps don't know Buglife or don't know much about us, we are the Invertebrate Conservation Trust, and we're the only organisation in Europe devoted to the conservation of all invertebrates. So that's not just insects, our bees, flies, that sort of thing. We also include spiders, mollusks, so everything that doesn't have a backbone, essentially. And our work is really sorry, I'm just admitting some more people. And really our work is to achieve sustainable populations of insects, and we want to halt their extinctions. And we do this through a number of different means. We raise awareness of invertebrates with landowners, managers, farmers, with the general public, really to demonstrate the importance of invertebrates and what they can do to help them out. So we offer very much practical advice. We also help shape policy. We run practical conservation projects, and we also inspire those around us to take action for invertebrates through events and really sort of allowing people to get up close to insects. We work in two main areas. That's pollinating insects, which we're obviously going to talk about this evening, and also freshwater invertebrates. It's really our focus on pollinating insects that has sort of led to the development of bee lines, which is something I'm going to just touch on briefly. Laurie, as I said, Laurie is going to definitely introduce you to the wonderful world of pollinating insects in a minute. So I'm not going to go into any great detail, but we do know that pollinators are in decline due to a number of factors. The most significant cause of decline is really the loss and degradation of habitats, which provide food, shelter and nesting sites for our pollinating insects. And we know that we've lost 97% of flower-rich grassland in the UK since the 1930s. And this has obviously left remaining habitat very fragmented and isolated. And there are many ways that we can halt and even reverse the declines of wild insect pollinators. And this is really through appropriate management of our countryside and towns. And here at Buglife, we have a vision that we can have a network of wildflower-rich areas across the UK, and this initiative is called Bee Lines, and really these are an imaginative solution to restoring sustainable populations of pollinators across the UK. So Bee Lines are 3 kilometre wide corridors connecting our best remaining wildflower-rich habitats, and really that aims to help pollinators move through the landscape in response to changing landscape and climate. This also provides a network to focus and prioritise the creation or restoration of pollinator habitat stepping stones to maximise benefits for wildlife. And they run through our countryside and towns and provide connected habitat for a host of wildlife, as well as bringing people closer to nature. And so by focusing our efforts on creating wildflower-rich areas in as many gaps along the bee lines as we can all sort of help out. Now the bee lines were mapped, and we finished a whole country map last year in 2021. Basically we sourced data from as many places as possible to help map out the best habitats for pollinators. And this includes things like chalk grasslands, meadows, heathlands, and we use computer modelling to determine the easiest pathway through all of these and how they might be linked. And then each county, Sussex included, had its own in-person workshops where local experts and stakeholders could help to decide the best route to take. So we have this map of the bee lines, and the most important thing to note really is that anyone can contribute to and be part of a bee line. Any habitat creation, no matter how small, can help, whether it's on some farmland, in a school playing field, in your garden, or some wildflower seeds planted in a window box. It all helps. It's very much a joint effort, and yeah, we need your help. On our website, you can add all your pollinator projects onto that, so we can really build up a picture of all the wonderful work that's been undertaken. And in Sussex, this is our bee lines, and it also brings me onto the Changing Chalk project, which is shown here in the purple. So Changing Chalk is a partnership project connecting nature, people and heritage on and around the South Downs. It's led by the National Trust and is a partnership of 10 organisations. And the project area stretches, as you can see from the map, those of you that know the area, from Eastbourne in the east to the River Ada in the west. And really the idea is to restore lost habitats, enhance wildlife, bring history and local cultures to life, and provide new experiences in the outdoors. And Buglife have 3 strands of work within this partnership. So the first up is our landscape for wild pollinators, and this really sort of builds in with our bee lines work. So we're lucky to have some amazing pollinating insects within the project. But as I mentioned, some of the sort of habitats are sort of isolated. So we've got lots of work trying to sort of work with farmers and that sort of thing to link up areas. So I'm going to briefly mention just a couple of our great species that we have. So the first one I'm going to mention is the Large Scabious Mining Bee. So this is a rare bee. It's a southern species, so its range currently extends as far north as South Wales and the North Norfolk coast, so sort of in a line between the two. And the Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire is one of its sort of real hotspots. So in Sussex, it's a species principally of chalk grassland, although across its range it does use sort of dry sandy grasslands as well. But in Sussex, and I'm using Sussex because the database tells me where in the number of species we have in Sussex rather than the sort of Changing Chalk project area. But in Sussex, we only have 39 records of this bee in the whole of Sussex. So it's centred around Castle Hill, just north of Brighton, and then on the downs over towards Woodingdean and Eastbourne, but there are scattered records elsewhere. So it's really very much a species of the project area. It's rare, and it's strongly associated with scabious flowers, in particular field scabious. So the females shown here collect pollen almost exclusively from field scabious, but they do occasionally use small scabious as well. And it's the pollen that it collects from the scabious that gives it a very characteristic pink colour. So you can see on its hind legs here, it's collected the pink pollen there. So this is really sort of fairly easy to identify from a good photo. If you see a fairly large mining bee with pink pollen on it, it's probably going to be this species. As with many of our sort of rare and declining species, it's a loss of habitat, and in particular the loss of its host plant as a result of agricultural intensification, urbanisation and scrub encroachment that's really sort of making it not do so well. So we've got lots of projects within Changing Chalk of trying to find this bee in new areas, but also to look at seeing if we can map some areas of field scabies as well, to see where those areas of field scabies are that we should go and check at the right time of year for the bee. Another one of our great species is the Hornet Robber Fly, and this is one of our biggest flies. It's over an inch long. It's got these lovely sort of black and yellow markings, so resembles a hornet, hence its name. And they have this amazing sort of ginger beard. They are hunters, so they catch beetles, grasshoppers, wasps, and they fly from sort of July to September or October. So the female lays her eggs on dung, so cow, horse or rabbit manure, and then the larvae are thought to feed on dung beetle grubs in the ground beneath, where they spend several years before they sort of pupate and emerge. So they are very reliant on grazing animals for the dung, and also for insect-rich habitats such as our chalk grassland for all of their sort of prey. This species declined by about 21% in the UK between 1980 and 2000, though numbers have now stabilised. So this is another one of those species that we're really keen to get more record for, encourage people to get out and look for the species. So for both of these species, we are going to be running some events to go out and look for them, and sort of train people up in where to go and look and that sort of thing. So lots of things that we can you can all get involved with. So other work that we're doing as part of this is we're working with farmers and landowners to raise awareness of pollinators, what they need to survive, and some actions that farmers and landowners can take to really sort of help them out. We're doing some habitat assessments on farms as well. We're also working with communities and the public, and we're running quite a lot of workshops and training on pollinator identification, how to improve pollinator habitats. Obviously, this talk is our first one as an introduction to pollinators. And we're really keen to recruit volunteers to become actively involved with schemes to monitor pollinating insects. So we're also working with a number of vineyards within the project area. And this is obviously an increasing land use within the Changing Chalk project area and elsewhere in the country as well. And really, we aim to work with vineyards in the area to identify ways in which they can make a sustainable and positive contribution to the conservation of insects, of insect pollinators and invertebrates more widely, and how that can sort of really link to our chalk grassland resource. We're really lucky that we're working with a couple of vineyards, so Everflight and Rathfinny Wine Estate, to trial some seed mixes to see how that might benefit pollinator species and hopefully the vines too. And then our final project is on the Wart-biter Bush Cricket. So this is a species, one of our most endangered species, actually. It's got lots of designations and is protected because of this. They're big, it's a big species. The adults measure between 31 and 37 millimeters, and they've got this long ovipositor as well, the females have, which you can see on this picture. So this is a species that is known from just 6 sites in Britain, 4 of which are within the South Downs National Park and Changing Chalk project area. Within Britain, it's probably always been confined to southern England, owing to sort of temperature-based limitations. Basically, it likes it hot. And it's currently confined to high-quality chalk grassland sites. So habitat structure is really critical for this species. They like sunny, well-sheltered grassland with a mosaic of bare ground and short turf for the nymphs and egg laying, and then taller, denser grassy tussocks for the adults. Nymphs and adults are omnivorous and therefore require a sort of grassland sward that supports plenty of small to medium-sized invertebrates which they feed on. So again, this is a species where the loss and fragmentation of high-quality chalk grassland has undoubtedly reduced the number of sites that can actually support this species. And like all bush crickets, the wart-biter sings or stridulates by rubbing its wings together. It's a fairly loud and distinctive song and sort of consists of a series of rapidly repeated clicks in short bursts and often lasts for several minutes. And this is how we monitor them, which is how some of you guys can get involved if you want to. We're very keen to get some volunteers involved with the monitoring of this species. Currently, this is done by one person, so it would be great to actually be able to spread that load a bit and also sort of going forward have more people trained up in actually be able to do this. So there are lots of ways that you can get involved. You can come along to one of our events or attend a training day. I'll leave my email address up at the end, so please do feel free to get in touch. You can look out for some of our target species that I've mentioned. And in particular this year, if you see any scabious flowers, so particularly field scabious when you're out and about, please do let us know so that we can check them out for the large scabious mining bee. I've just mentioned that you can get involved with our Wart-biter project as well. We're going to be running some public events for the wart-biters and also some events for sort of training for volunteers. We'll be offering lots of training, mentoring, support. And as I said, I'll leave my email address up, so do feel free to keep in touch. We've got a couple of dates organised for these at the end of July already, if you are interested. So that's it from me. That's my email address. I will just stop sharing. And I think what we'll do is if you've got any questions, we'll answer them at the end. I think what we'll do is we will just go straight over to Laurie, and she can get going on introducing us to the wonderful world of pollinators.
Thank you. Bear with me just a sec. Oh, getting there. Getting warmer. Okay, does that look good, Alice? Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Well, hi everyone. Nice to see you all. And thank you, Alice, for asking me along today. So as Alice said, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an introduction to pollinating insects. Half an hour, 45 minutes, something like that. I will try and keep an eye on the time. I'm just going to really talk to you a little bit about who our pollinators are. So I'm going to give a bit of an introduction to this broadly to their ecology, talk a little bit about some of the threats to pollinators, and Alice has touched on some of those already. And then just a few ideas about how you can help. And as I said, this is really an introduction, but hopefully it will keep you kind of, get you kind of keen to find out more and come along to some more of the Buglife training sessions that are happening. So we've had a really lovely introduction already to invertebrates. There are more than 40,000 species in the UK, and they are doing an awful lot of things for us, probably quite underappreciated. Pollination, of course, is the kind of key one that we're thinking of today, but invertebrates are involved in lots of other things as well. So they're dispersing seeds, moving seeds around in the soil, aerating the soil, really, really important. Lots of invertebrates involved in that. And then all sorts of sort of cycling of nutrients, both plant and animal. So they are really, really important species. There's also biological control. I'll touch on that actually a little bit, bizarrely, while we're talking about pollinators. Hopefully you'll notice that when I get to it. But also I think just enjoyment. For me and Alice, and I'm sure lots of other people, including some of you here, invertebrates are a great source of enjoyment. So let's just quickly, there's not just the only point where we'll have sad news tonight, but we do know that our invertebrates are in trouble. Unfortunately, we've seen quite broad scale declines across lots of different groups. It's estimated something like almost 1,300 species of invertebrates have become extinct in the UK in the last sort of century. And this includes sort of ants and bees, beautiful butterflies like this large copper, thankfully still extant globally, but no longer present in the UK. And I'll sort of hone in on some of the sort of data related to pollinating insects a little bit later in the talk. So, as I said, this is really just a little bit of an introduction to particularly those insects that are involved in pollination. So, of course, the first sort of obvious place to start is, well, what is pollination? Probably not new to any of you. It's basically just the movement of pollen from one flower to another flower, enabling it to be fertilised and to produce its seed, so its next generation. And pollination can happen in a number of ways. It can be done by the wind. Anyone who has hay fever is probably well aware of that at this time of year. Also things like water sometimes play a role, but actually it's animals and often insects that are really the sort of really key vectors for pollen transport. And most sort of pollination involves an animal. And as I said, usually that is an insect. So why are we concerned about pollination? It's a very important ecosystem service that's provided. It's valued within the UK at something like £500+ million a year to our crop production. So it is a really important service that's kind of critical for food. It also underpins our ecosystem. So if we look at the sort of temperate areas, so where we are in the UK, about 78% of our plants rely on pollination by an animal. If you go to the tropics, that rises to almost sort of 95%. So pollination of animals, so the transport of pollen between plants, is absolutely critical. And we know there's been lots and lots of research on particularly bees, but a little bit of research on some of the other groups of pollinating insects as well. We know that good quality pollination, so we've got where we have a healthy community of wild pollinating insects, increases the yield, increases the quality and the marketability of many different crop species. And I'll try and sort of mention a couple of examples of that as we go along. So although, you know, thinking of things in commercial terms is useful, important, actually it's also I suppose very important to just note that pollination is really key in sustaining our wildflower populations, and these are the things that obviously form the habitats where other things live. So there has been some sort of linking together in Northern Europe of the decline in plants and the decline in the abundance and the diversity of pollinators. So there's clearly a very sort of key relationship between the two. So thinking about pollinating insects, if I were to sort of ask you, perhaps not showing you this slide first, to picture a pollinator, most of you would possibly think of this one. So this is the honeybee. She's all over the media. This is what people think of when we think of pollinating insects. But actually, I hope by the end of this talk that you will be persuaded that she is not the only species on the block, and actually there are a lot more other, I'm going to say, important pollinators than the honeybee. Just as a kind of introduction to that, there was, and we can send you out references if people are interested in delving into this more, there was a study on sort of 40 odd crop systems worldwide that found that it's the wild pollinators, so the wild bees, and I'll sort of go on to this distinction in a short while, but really are kind of key in providing good quality pollination because of their behaviour and the way in which they sort of forage and visit flowers. And honeybees, so as a managed pollinator, they can supplement this, but they definitely can't replace it. So really what we want is diverse communities of wild pollinators. So if we actually think of picturing a pollinator, we should be thinking of ladies like these. So a couple of our lovely, a solitary bee here and a bumblebee on the right. So there's around about probably something like 4,000 species of insects getting involved in pollination in the UK. So much more than just that one species, the honeybee. Bees are a really kind of key part of this story. So there's around about 270 species of bees in the UK, and I'll sort of give you a bit of an overview of those. Wild pollinators thought to be responsible for about 65% of crop pollination in the UK. But it isn't just bees, there's also a whole army of flies. So there's a couple of beautiful hoverflies here, often maybe an underappreciated group as pollinators, but there are sort of more studies coming forward, particularly on things like hoverflies, and certainly our understanding of flies as pollinators are really sort of gaining momentum. Just as an aside, it's not a UK example, but for anyone that enjoys chocolate, that is pollinated by a fly. So they definitely do have some commercial importance. There are also lots of other insects getting in on the act, so lots of butterflies, moths and beetles. And again, although they might not be sort of commercially significant as far as we know in the UK, for example, beetles are the key pollinator for palm oil, which is obviously found in lots of our food. And there has been some research done in the UK that's found moths kind of carrying pollen grains from soybeans to peas and even oilseed rape. So they probably are kind of supplementing and complementing the work of other species like the various bees that we'll be talking about. So there is this whole sort of community, really. That's kind of the thing that I would like to put across, that are getting involved. So as I said, I'm just going to give you a real kind of quick overview about the ecology of some of these species. And I'm going to start with the bees. So as I said, sort of 270 species of bees in the UK, and we can broadly split those into the bumblebees, we've got our honeybee, the managed pollinator, and solitary bees, which make up the biggest chunk. I'll talk very briefly about flies, focusing on hoverflies, very, very briefly about butterflies and moths and beetles. And yeah, just to give you a quick overview of them. And I hope also through some of these beautiful photos, which are all sort of mostly from Stephen Falk, you'll just get a real appreciation for the diversity and the beauty of these species. So if we're thinking about pollinators, they do have very simple needs in one regard. I mean, much the same as all of the rest of us. Fundamentally, they just need somewhere to shelter and something to eat. So really quite simple. Places to breed, places to spend the winter that can be different for some of these species, and then food, both as a larva and as an adult, and that might be different. So I'm going to come on to that again as I sort of go through. So all of these kind of 4 insect orders that I've mentioned, so the bees, the flies, the butterflies and moths, and the beetles, they're all insects which undergo metamorphosis. So they'll have this introductory egg phase, then they have the larval phase, which is really just about eating and fattening up. Then they'll go into this sort of fascinating pupal phase where they undergo this metamorphosis, coming out the other end as a winged adult. So the real priority is about breeding and perhaps dispersing and sort of expanding their range, colonizing new patches. So that's just sort of something to have in the back of your mind as we go through the next few slides. So as I said, we'll focus on the bees first of all. So we've got 25 species of bumblebees in Britain, and about 225 species of solitary bees and just 1 honeybee. Bees are have got 2 pairs of wings. It's quite difficult probably to see from most of the photos that I show you that they have 2 pairs of wings. You're going to have to take my word for it, because they have this lovely system where the wings kind of slot together and almost look like one flat plane. And they've got these lovely long segmented antennae here. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse moving or not, but yes, at the front of this bee here, you'll see lovely segmented antennae. You can even tell what the sex is of the bee if you've got good enough eyesight and by counting the numbers on those antennae. So just starting at the beginning with our bumblebee species, these can be social or they can be sort of solitary, as take that communal bit out, apologies for that. Most of the bumblebee species are social, so they live in this society that's dominated by a queen. Most bumblebee species are going to be sort of just sort of living in a colony that's active for around about 3 or 4 months. And they're all sort of reliant on flowers. So they're gathering flowers, visiting flowers, sorry, to gather pollen. So that's protein. The protein is to feed to their young. So that's a very kind of important thing that they're taking from the flowers, but also they're visiting for the nectar. So the sugar that's going to sort of power the flight. For some species, they can be quite picky. So for some species, they're really quite tied to a limited range of plant species. This is generally for their pollen needs. And for bumblebees, for some of the rarer species, they're really kind of very highly dependent on Fabaceae, so legume, the pea family, and that's what they're really sort of kind of focusing their efforts on. So these guys, as I said, have got an annual life cycle. In the winter months, that's really just the queen that's the sort of mated queens that are around, but they'll be hibernating. So they could be hibernating for sort of 5 or 6 months potentially. 19 of our species are social, and so they will be having these lovely sort of colonies, and I'll show you a photo of what a bumblebee colony looks like in a couple of slides time. The colonies are founded by the queen, and she will sort of produce the first batch of workers, and then they will go out and they'll be sort of flying after sort of 4 or 5 weeks, and they'll be bringing in pollen and nectar supplies and rearing the next generation. And as I said, that sort of lifespan of that colony will last for about 4 months. 6 of our 25 species of bumblebees, however, are cuckoos, and I will touch on cuckoos a little bit later again, but basically these are slightly, I suppose, I mean, I think cuckoos are wonderful, but maybe perhaps slightly sneaky in that they will actually usurp the nest of another bumblebee. They will take it over, they will either kill or subdue the queen, and they will use her workers to raise their own young. It's a really interesting life cycle. So bumblebees, particularly those that are social, perhaps not the usurpers so much, do need often very extensive patches of flowering resources, because setting up a nest is energetically very expensive. So there was some research that looked at some of our early flying bumblebees, and they estimated, I think it was about 41,000 flowers that a buff-tailed bumblebee queen would need to visit in order to sort of successfully found a nest, or found a successful nest. So, you know, they do really rely on having good availability of flowering resource. And actually, you'll often see when people talk about bees, this reference to tongue length. And that's actually to do with the availability of flowering resource and whether a bee can access it or not. And I will come back to this later, but generally bumblebees have relatively long tongues, so up to something like 20 millimeters for things like the garden bumblebee, which is the one you'll see foraging in foxgloves. And bees can really make use of flowers with very long flower tubes, the corolla, so things like figworts, as I said, various pea family, things in the mint family. Sorry, my doorbell's ringing. I hope it will stop in a minute. And as I mentioned, some species do use a limited range of, the joys of Zoom, a limited range of plant species. So I mentioned that I was going to show you a bumblebee nesting site, and this is one here. So you can see this beautiful sort of slightly shambolic collection of pots, and effectively the bees will line each one of these pots with some pollen and some nectar for the larvae that will be developing inside. Some of the bees actually will just dump the provisions on top, and it's a little bit of a free-for-all. In terms of the nesting sites for bumblebees, they broadly have 2 different options that they use. So quite a lot of the species are subterranean nesters. So they will actually reuse things like old mammal holes under sort of rocks and tree holes, and that's where they'll sort of found their nest. And you'll often see the big queen bumblebees of things like the red-tailed bumblebee, the buff-tailed bumblebee, early in the year sort of flying around and sort of investigating little sort of cracks and crevices, and they're looking for these potential nesting sites. The other option for bees, and this is things like the carder bees, is an open nesting. So they're tending to use things like grass tussocks, and that's where they will found their nests. The nest sites are much, much smaller than those of honeybee, for example. So a typical bumblebee nest may have somewhere between about 50 and about 200 workers. So really a much smaller affair than a honeybee nest. Also, there is this need for a site for hibernation. So as I mentioned, the colony itself will last for maybe 4 months. And at the end of the cycle, what you have really sort of going into the autumn and winter, the only things surviving are the new queens of the year, and they will hibernate to survive the winter. Before they do so, they need to sort of forage and fatten up a little bit to reach a sort of weight to survive the winter. And then they really need sort of undisturbed areas, so things like north-facing banks, sort of wood piles, those kind of things where they can sort of keep sort of safe and relatively cool, and they will just sort of sit out the winter there. So moving on to solitary bees. So I said this is a bit of a quick whiz through. So solitary bees makes up the biggest kind of chunk of our bee species in the UK. And these guys can be social, or often it's called eusocial because it's sort of somewhere towards being social, but in a quite simplified way. They can be sort of communal in that they're nesting in the same area. So often we see these nesting banks, there's lots of sort of bees whizzing around together, but actually each one is kind of independent, but they're just sort of nesting communally, or they can be completely solitary. So most of these species will only be living around about 8 weeks as a flying adult. So that's kind of a really important thing, and I'll come back to this again as well as we go through to bear in mind. The bees that you're seeing now at this point in the year, so sort of coming towards late June, are not the same bees that you'll be seeing in March. They're not the same bees that you'll be seeing in September. So this is why it's really important to have lots of foraging resources available throughout the year. And again, these guys are visiting plants for pollen and for nectar. So they are also provisioning their larvae with pollen and sort of using the nectar to sort of power themselves up. Again, there are species that can be very choosy, and you saw Alice mentioned the bee that's only found on scabious. There are others that use, and again, this is for their pollen, that will just forage on things like ivy. There are bees that will forage only on things like loosestrife. So where they do have this very kind of specific link with the plant, that can really limit their sort of ability to sort of found colonies. So an important thing to mention about solitary bees is that they collect what's called dry pollen. So this Dasypoda here, she's a great example of a solitary bee's equipment for gathering pollen. She's quite an exaggerated example, but hopefully you can make out all over her legs those bright yellow hairs. And it's these hairs, they're called scopa, sort of quite stiff hairs. These are where the bees will gather the pollen that they're collecting. A lot of them also, you'll see hairs underneath the abdomen, so things like the leafcutter bees. And this is a little bit different to what the honeybees do and what the bumblebee do, because those guys will actually mix the pollen with a little bit of nectar, a bit of saliva, and make wet pollen. And it tends to kind of clump together and sort of stick onto their pollen baskets a little bit better. These solitary bees with the dry pollen, they're basically a little bit sort of messy. So it kind of makes them actually probably less efficient as a pollen gatherer from the point of view of taking it back to their nest, but more efficient as a pollinator, because each time they visit another plant, they're more likely to have some of that pollen brushed off of them. So they are very, very effective pollinators. There's been a couple of really interesting studies that compare solitary bees and honeybees. So there was one study that showed 600 solitary bees, they estimated would carry out as much pollination as 30,000 honeybees, so a hive's worth of honeybees, which is a pretty amazing statistic, something to be quite proud of if you're a solitary bee, I'd say. Another thing just to mention on these guys, and I will come back to this again as well later on, is that the foraging area will really vary in between these solitary bees and also bees in general. So a lot of the very small solitary bees will only forage perhaps 100 to 200 meters from their nesting site. So that's in a relatively discrete area, which means it's really important that we have lots of sort of flowery patches widely sort of scattered through the landscape. Sometimes I kind of say little and often, but I think a lot and often would be better than little and often. So that's quite different to things like bumblebees. Bumblebees will forage maybe 500 meters from their nest, and honeybees are up to sort of 3 kilometers potentially. So when we're thinking about nesting sites, so staying on the solitary bees here, again, there are several different sites that they will use. So a lot of solitary bees mine into bare soil, and hopefully all of you have experienced just the joy of seeing a nesting bee bank. You know, they really do literally buzz with life when it's one of these sort of gregarious species, and you know, particularly things like the ivy bee, there can be thousands and thousands of these bees buzzing around as they provision their nests. But there are some that nest in they're called aerial nesters, so they will nest in decaying wood, so they'll reuse old beetle holes, for example. Some of them will even nest into things like bramble, and there are even a couple of species that use old snail shells. So there's all sorts of different things. Some of them will bring in sort of mud or resin or chewed up leaves, so the leafcutter bees, to make these sort of little nest cells for themselves. And they, within their nest, will create little chambers, so often a sort of linear chamber where you'll have a nest cell and then the next one and the next one, and each one of those cells will be provisioned with pollen and nectar and an egg laid in there, and the larvae will feed on those resources and then generally turn into a pupa, and that's how they'll spend the winter. Not for every species, but for quite a lot of them. So most of these bees, you'll only see them sort of at one point in the year, these sort of solitary bee species. There are a few that have 2 flight seasons during the year. You'll find that the males will emerge first, and then they'll sort of hang around waiting on sort of flowers for the females to emerge, and then they'll start that sort of cycle all over again. And as I said, because they are sort of only present for maybe a couple of months of the year as a flying adult, there really is quite a seasonality to these different species. So there'll be different species in the spring, different species in the summer, and different species in the autumn. So just to kind of, for the sense of completeness, to just talk a little bit about the honeybee. And as I said, quite different, the ecology of the honeybee, to all of the other sort of wild bee species. So this is something that has been widely managed as a pollinator and sort of moved around. They do have a very sort of different ecology, and if we are kind of thinking of pollinator conservation, it's almost best in a way to ignore what this bee is capable of. So it lives for a lot longer. You can see the queen will survive for several years, and the colony size is much, much larger. So on average, maybe about 30,000 workers in a honeybee nest. Although that will decline in the winter, there's still going to be perhaps 5,000 workers present. So this is a lot sort of bigger army of workers to go out gathering pollen and nectar. Again, these are collecting wet pollen, so it can make them sort of they're very efficient at collecting pollen, but perhaps not as efficient at pollinating as the solitary bees, as I mentioned. And honeybees do also sort of specialise. So as they go through their lives, they basically have different duties. So each individual worker bee will live for probably around about a month, and they'll begin in their sort of early years and their teenage years as having hive-based duties, so keeping the hive warm or keeping it cool, and then they'll start foraging when they're around about 3 weeks old, and that's sort of how they'll sort of see out their days. Naturally, they would use things like tree holes, and of course they readily will take up hives that we provide for them. So that's just a little bit about those species. So I've mentioned foraging as we've gone through those different kinds of bees, but just to, I guess, pull out the kind of few really key points when we're thinking about bees and foraging, and I'll link again to this when we talk about what we can do to help bees. because we do have these different bee species present throughout the year, an unbroken supply of food is really, really important if we want to support a healthy and diverse community of bees and other pollinating insects. So thinking broadly from sort of March to October, having availability of nectar and pollen, and also being mindful that some species are relying on just a single plant species. Bees are what's called a central place forager. So effectively, if you think of their nesting site, that is the sort of centre of their world. And that's where they're going to be sort of radiating out from, like sort of spokes on a bike, seeking food. And I mentioned already that some of these sort of smaller bees are really kind of only perhaps foraging within 100 to 200 metres of their nest. And those are the ones that are often really disadvantaged when habitats become fragmented. So what you see, there's been sort of research into this that finds they really do suffer from reduced sort of productivity. So their brood size is smaller when they're constantly being forced to forage at their kind of maximum distance from their nest. So same thing we can see in things like birds, for example. Oh dear, sorry, how do I might just need to, I just managed to go, whoops, sorry, right to the end there we go, press the wrong button, sorry about that. So I'm not going to go into detail about kleptoparasites and cuckoos. I've mentioned them briefly with regards to the bumblebees, but just to sort of say that there is this whole community of other insects that are associated with bees, and particularly the social bees. So there's all sorts of interesting sort of bumblebees, flies, beetles and solitary bees that are effectively stealing resources from the solitary bees, but actually a very kind of important community of insects in their own right. So 6 different species of cuckoo, bumblebee in the UK, and about a third of the solitary bees are what's called a kleptoparasite. So they're laying their eggs inside the nest of one of the other bee species, and then beautiful things like that oil beetle in the middle, and various sort of range of bee flies that you can see in the middle at the bottom. So I'm going to really quickly talk about hoverflies particularly. Just sort of thinking about flies more generally, there's about 7,000 species in the UK, found across all sorts of different habitats, all habitats really, and with a wide range of feeding habitats. So there are predators, there are scavengers, parasites, plant feeders, deadwood feeders, fungi feeders, but a lot of flies are visiting flowers and feeding on nectar and pollen, and many flies are pollinators. So one of the kind of best studied groups in terms of pollination is the hoverflies, so a lovely sort of family of flower visiting flies, and these can be considered as important pollinators. So it's sort of something that's only just sort of starting to be looked into, but there's been sort of research on things like strawberries and melons and all sorts of different things that show that actually flies are very kind of key pollinators. So these have actually only got one pair of wings, much as some of them, like the one on the bottom right there, might try and persuade you that they're a bee. If you count up the wings and have a look at those sort of short, stumpy antennae, you'll see that they're most definitely a fly. And they have these very sort of short, spongy mouth parts in general. So you might be able to make it out on a couple of the photos, these sort of lovely sort of dabby sort of mouth parts. So they do tend to prefer open flowers, so you can see most of these flowers that these bees are these flies are on are in the rose family or in the daisy family, and again these are visiting flowers for the pollen and for the nectar, so both for the protein and for the sugar hit. But unlike the bees, they're not carrying the pollen away sort of intentionally, so they're not provisioning for their young, but because they're sort of obviously usually kind of lovely and hairy, it does mean that they kind of get pollen stuck on them and they will be sort of moving it around. And also their behaviour in the way that they visit flowers, they're quite sort of meticulous in sort of visiting flowers, and they will move between the flowers in a patch, mean that they're very sort of good pollinators. The other sort of added benefit of hoverflies is that they do, many of them have predatory larvae. So it's just under a half of the hoverfly species that we have in Britain have got predatory larvae. So these are active predators, and you can see one on the left here, basically hunting down aphids and thrips and plant lice, so all of the kind of things that give gardeners headaches. And it's supposed to be around about 1,000 aphids, for example, that a marmalade hoverfly larva would eat in its larval stage before it becomes an adult. So that's one of the commonest hoverflies that you'll spot. When they're not predatory, these larvae are often developing on decaying materials, so sometimes aquatic, so in sort of ditches and ponds, things like that. And there are a few that are scavengers in nests. So there are some hoverflies that actually grow up in bee and wasp nests. So they'll be eating the pollen and the nectar that's been provisioned for the young bees. Poor old bees have a bit of a hard time of it. And then just really quickly, just as a reminder really, that moths and butterflies can be pollinators as well. So got about 59 species of butterflies in the UK, plus some regular migrants, but about 2,500 plus species of moths. And lots of these will be visiting plants to feed on the nectar. But again, they will be sort of moving pollen around as they do so, and they can be important pollinators, particularly of wildflowers. And things like moths, for example, will be visiting flowers that are mostly flowering and are become particularly scented at night. Not going to sort of talk too much more about those, and also just really quickly to mention beetles. So again, they are going out there pollinating. It's thought that beetles were probably the order of insects where this kind of relationship between plants and insects first developed. They've got these sort of lovely kind of chewing mouth parts, and again they're just visiting the plants for a snack, but again being quite hairy, so things like the chafers and the longhorns, they will be moving pollen around as well. So just a little bit about decline in insects, and I don't want it to be a sort of demotivating talk, but we do need to kind of tackle these things head on, and we know that many of our sort of common and widespread insect species are unfortunately in decline, and it's thought to be about 2/3 of pollinating insects in the UK. We've lost 2 bumblebee species, and we've seen big declines in some of the others. So 6 of our bumblebee species have declined by sort of 80% plus in just the last sort of 50 years or so. We're seeing declines in moth species and extinctions in around about 60 moth species, and about 3/4 of butterflies have declined in abundance or occurrence, or both of those things. There's all sorts of studies that have shown quite sort of frightening results. So there's quite a famous study that came out of Germany showing 75% in flying insects, and then there was a sort of recent study that showed from the UK that showed a decline of about 60% in flying insects. And I think we probably all have you know, anecdotal evidence, I suppose, around sort of moths that we see flying around at night or dancing around lights, and the amount of things that are sort of splattered on windscreens. So we know we are seeing declines in insects. What's causing those declines? And Alice has touched on these already. A lot of it is around land use change. That's really a kind of key one. So loss of habitat, degradation of habitat, fragmentation is a really key one. So I've mentioned the fact that a lot of these bees will only travel relatively short distances. Also kind of homogenization of habitat. So there's a lot of habitat that's, for want of a better word, quite samey now. You know, a lot of our sort of really species-rich grasslands and other habitats have kind of been replaced by much more sort of improved versions where there's a limited range of foraging resources available. On top of that, there is, of course, the increase in the use of chemicals, also climate change, which is realistically going to have mixed results for insects. It could provide some benefits in some ways, but certainly it is a threat, particularly increasing drought and decreasing availability of plants at key times potentially. And then there are various sort of invasive species. There's pests and diseases that have been moved around as we sort of move things like honeybees around and other other bumblebees as well. Really, it's quite complex. There's a lot of interacting factors, but you know, a key one, as I said, is changing habitat. So again, Alice has mentioned already this loss of 3 million hectares of flower-rich grassland since the 1930s. This represents a huge loss of resource, and I've just sort of broken down there what we have sort of left behind of some of our sort of flower-rich open habitats. So you can see really quite a sort of small area of meadows, species-rich meadows remaining. So this is really kind of putting a lot of pressure on various species, and particularly species like pollinating insects that really thrive where you've got sort of flower-rich habitat. Chemicals also have had a big impact. I'm not going to go into lots of the details here, but you'll undoubtedly have heard of neonicotinoids. Those, when used, actually often were used as a sort of seed coating, and actually, although that was designed to sort of avoid spraying chemicals around, unfortunately the mechanism meant that the chemical still ends up in all parts of the plant, so it ends up in the pollen and nectar. So there's still a direct way in which insects visiting flowers will come into contact with the chemical. There's been lots of research on bees and the impact on bees that have found all sorts of things around impairing their ability to navigate and their ability to learn. Effectively, bees going out, being away from the colony for longer, and actually getting lost potentially, so more of them not actually making it back to the colony. Also things around reducing colony growth and difficulties in transitioning between those sort of stages of the life cycle, and also making them more vulnerable to other things like viruses. So as I said, I'm not going to go into great detail, but just to give you a bit of an overview about some of the impacts of various sort of pesticides and other chemicals. And again, these are sort of interacting often. So what is the cost of declines? I mean, if we're going to think of it sort of from a purely sort of monetary point of view, there was a calculation that within the UK, if we lost all of our pollinating insects and had to replace their service with hand pollination, it would cost about 1.8 billion every year, which doesn't feel very economically viable or particularly desirable in any way. So I mentioned already the fact that pollinators really do have a positive impact on yield of lots of different crop species. So there's sort of studies on everything from sort of cherries to blueberries to kiwi fruits and all sorts of things. So lots of kind of positive economic impacts. I talked a little bit already, I think, about the sort of behaviour of some of these species, like the systematic way in which hoverflies forage. So there's been research on strawberries, and they found longer shelf life when there's been sort of good visitation rates of hoverflies, something to do with reducing the sugar to acid ratio or something like that. Yeah, pollinators have a kind of real ability to increase the sort of market value and output. Actually, even for crops like oilseed rape, which are wind pollinated, when they've done exclusion experiments, so actually stopping bees from visiting them, they've shown that there is a reduction in the yield in those crops. So just going to sum up for the last sort of 5 minutes or so about what we can do to help pollinating insects. So just to recap, they don't want much. They're simple creatures. They just need food as a larva, food as an adult, and then some shelter for breeding and overwintering. And then, of course, a landscape in which all of these resources are available and accessible to them. So what does that look like? What can we do? So as individuals, you know, we can create insect-friendly habitats. So, and I'll talk a little bit about gardens in a second, but, you know, we can do things like reducing our light pollution, for example. We can look at what we are, the chemicals that we're choosing to use or not use. We can also, I suppose, firstly increase our own awareness and appreciation, but then actually try and sort of nurture it in others as well, and really try and get people engaged with these species, getting to know them and understand them, and actually realise how important they are for us. When we're thinking about if you're lucky enough to have a garden or an allotment, some kind of open space, there are lots of things that you can do, you know, even in a very small patch. You can provide flowering resources that are going to benefit these species. I guess the key things to think about are less intensive management. So again, of course, no chemicals, but also leaving areas undisturbed. Hopefully a lot of you who do have gardens got involved with No Mow May and actually carried that on into June. So you've got sort of an array of flowering resources available. Again, thinking about that sort of idea of having a long season of flowering resources. So think about the way in which you're managing woody habitats. So things like hedges, actually, rather than sort of clipping them every year, leaving them for a few years will actually make sure that they're providing much sort of more flowering resource. And also, and I know for some of you this is going to be a bit of a swear word, but ivy is an incredibly important food resource at the end of the year. So if you need persuading, just write yourself a note in your diary for September, October time, go out and have a look at the ivy during the day and at night, and you'll see there are lots and lots of bees and flies and moths that are visiting that, because as we get to that point in the year, there's a lot less food around. So if you can provide nesting opportunities as well, so undisturbed areas and banks for things like the bumblebees. If you've got dead wood, that's a really great habitat as well. You can, if you've got space for a pond or even something like a hoverfly lagoon, you can create sort of nesting opportunities there. So sort of just standing water with some nice sort of decaying vegetation in it. And then as land managers, if you have even more space, it's going to be a lot of the same. I mean, the principles are exactly the same. So looking after the existing sort of flower rich areas that you have, increasing the features, so what I'd call useful features, so things like hedgerows, ditches, banks, and increasing the linkages between them. And again, really thinking about this availability of food throughout the year, and thinking of linking features together at a sort of pollinator scale. So really aiming for no more than 500 meters between patches. Just going to really quickly sort of, I guess, again, recap some of these things. So I know I've mentioned these things already, but it's just really key to think in terms of seasonality when we're thinking of these species. So right from that first sort of beautiful flush of blackthorn and willow in the early part of the spring, so less intensive management of woody habitats, our lovely meadows that are kind of on display right now with a sort of much wider array of flowers, and then all the way through to the kind of late flowering species, including the ivy. Plant type, so again, just to sort of a reminder that some of the things like flies, for example, and some of the solitary bees have got very short tongues, while some of the bumblebees have got very long tongues. So actually having different kinds of plants will really kind of make sure that there are species that are accessible for all. Also, as I mentioned, some of the bees are quite choosy in the flowers that they visit for their pollen. I've just realised the next slide, so pretty much the same thing, so I'll skip over that one. Just in terms of some of the top pollinator plant families, we've got things like the mint family, so the labiates, things like the pea family, the clovers and birdsfoot trefoils, the rose family, so things like the knapweeds, oxeye daisies, hawkbits. These are all really kind of key families, the umbellifer family as well. So having a sort of mixture between sort of open flowers and sort of long, deep flowers can be really beneficial. So there's just a few ideas there of species that are important. And when we're thinking of cultivated plants, a lot of the fruit trees and shrubs, as you would expect, so apples and pears, blackcurrants, raspberries, all really good news for pollinating insects. Alliums can be great, things like strawberries, artichokes, and then our sort of deeper flowers, so things like Aquilegia, columbine, comfreys, borages are all really popular, and all the sort of herbs, marjoram, lavender, thyme. These are all the sort of things that you can plant to really provide resources for pollinators. As I mentioned, these species obviously need somewhere to live, not just things to eat. So providing sort of opportunities for nesting is really key. I mentioned hoverfly lagoon earlier. So here's one I made earlier on the right. It's effectively just a bucket filled with rainwater and some decaying leaves, and many hoverfly species will very merrily lay their eggs there, and the larvae will develop within that. And then as they emerge as an adult, they will pollinate your strawberries to say thank you. You might have opportunities for bee nesting with, you know, sort of little banks, or drilling holes into deadwood, or leaving some standing deadwood. So these are all sort of things that can be beneficial. And then just finally, and again, sort of this is something that Alice has talked about, and hopefully something that many of you will get involved with the Changing Chalk project, but it is really kind of important that we do track progress and record these species. So you know, any sort of pollinator species that you're finding, if you can record the data, that will be useful for people like Alice in terms of their conservation work. It helps us to understand how populations are changing, what the patterns might be in that, and it helps us to recognise when things are going well and when things are going less well, so we know when we need to sort of set priorities and take action. And also importantly, it lets us check out that the measures that we're putting in place are effective. So I think I will stop there. As I said, a really kind of quick overview, but hopefully a few useful things in there. And I will stop sharing my screen now. And thank you for listening.
Fantastic, Laurie. Thank you so much for that. That was really interesting. Lots of advice and tips. So yeah, that's really great. I'm just gonna have a quick look in the chat. So Dave Boddington has asked, where is the best place to record the data?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I could, but I was going to ask you.
So I would say, Dave, I mean, I personally use iRecord. I think it's really useful. Anyone, I don't know if everyone is Sussex based here, so I'm just going to make a big assumption that you are, and apologies if you're not. Sussex Biodiversity Record Centre, who are a brilliant resource for us in the county, they're very happy for people to use iRecord, and they will sort of share that data with all the relevant people, and then that can also be used by people like Alice in her work. So yeah, that's the most useful one, and there's lots of sort of monitoring schemes to get involved with. So there's ones around bumblebees, butterflies, and there's just a general pollinator monitoring scheme as well. Hope that helps.
Brilliant. Couldn't have said better than myself. So.
Yeah, but do add something if I've forgotten.
No, I think that's very much covered it. I'm just looking through the questions. There's not actually that many questions, so if anybody has got anything.
Can I just say, yay, Lindsay. I'm glad that you've noticed the ivy.
Exactly. That's great. So Lindsay has also asked if the volunteering is just in the south. So yeah, pollinator surveys can be done absolutely anywhere. We're just talking about the South Downs because that's where the Changing Chalk project is. But yeah, absolutely, you can do pollinator surveys wherever.
Can you hear me?
I can, Lindsay.
Oh, hi. Sorry,
hi.
I'm on my husband's computer with headphones. I'm not entirely sure how it works. I've not used it yet. So I actually volunteer for the Heart of England Forest. So I'm in the Midlands. I'm in Warwickshire. Okay. And we do a lot of species surveys. I'm just wondering if we could have any sort of link up. So we do a lot of butterfly, moth surveys, damselflies, dragonflies, and bees as well. So I don't know whether you're involved with them yet, or if you're aware of them, and whether we can have some sort of link up.
We are, so I'm just based down in Sussex. So Buglife don't have any project office in the Midlands at the moment, so we're very much project based.
Yeah.
But I can easily pass on some information of the sorts of things you could do. There's a wonderful thing called a flower insect time count, which is a very easy way to sort of do some pollinator monitoring. So I can easily sort of put you in touch with some of that, but unfortunately we don't have any staff in the Midlands.
Okay, well then maybe we could share some of our data with you guys, and
well, I'm sure that would be fantastic.
Some sort of join up to see, I don't know, if our corridors link in some way.
Absolutely, yeah, that would be fine. Yeah, absolutely. If actually I can send out some information just after this, so I'll make sure my email's on there, so you can contact me, and then you'll have that as well, and we can take this sort of offline.
Okay, lovely, thank you.
Dave, you've asked about training schemes about identifying pollinators. Yes, I will send that information out afterwards as well, so we've got lots planned, so I shall make sure you have all of that. Sarah has asked, she says, missed the beginning, so you might have mentioned this. Are wasps pollinators? I'll let you answer that one, Laurie.
They can be, yes, because they will be visiting flowers as well. So they're not taking pollen to provision a nest, because wasps are carnivores in that their larvae are carnivores, so they're feeding other insects generally to their young. But no, certainly the adults will be visiting and taking pollen and nectar. So yeah, absolutely they can be.
Fantastic, thanks Laurie. Right, I shall just scroll up to the beginning, but I think that's all our questions. So unless anybody's got anything else, either in the chat or speak up now, that's absolutely fine. If any more questions, if not, thank you very much for coming along. I hope you've had a good evening. Talk's been fabulous, and it'd be wonderful if some of you want to come and get involved with some of our work on Changing Chalk. And as I said, I'll make sure my email address gets sent out to all of you, so you'll have that. So please do just get in contact. But other than that, thanks for coming along, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.